Some people don't trip over the truth. They choke on it the moment it slips out. That's exactly what happened here. One tiny crack in their story, one slip in their rehearsed smiles, and suddenly the entire plot they built against you collapsed like a cheap plastic chair under a heavyweight lie. They didn't mean to confess. Oh no, their plan wasn't supposed to end with them spilling everything like a toddler dropping a bowl of cereal. But pressure has a funny way of turning masterminds into accidental whistleblowers. Here's a fact. According to behavioral psychology, people involved in hidden wrongdoing unconsciously start revealing pieces of the truth long before they're caught. Their posture changes, their tone shifts, their memory becomes inconsistent, and eventually the weight of their own secrecy forces a leak. That's exactly what happened in your story. They weren't noble, they weren't remorseful, they simply ran out of emotional storage space. Humans are terrible vaults, and what makes this even more interesting is why they cracked. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't fear, it wasn't morality suddenly waking up from a deep sleep. They cracked because the truth they tried to bury kept growing sharp edges, and those edges began cutting them from the inside. They cracked because the version of you they plotted against no longer exists, and reality exposed them faster than their lies could protect them. They cracked because pretending became harder than confessing. And let's be honest, watching the whole plot unfold was unintentionally hilarious. They tried to act calm, but their nervous laugh gave Wi-Fi struggling to reconnect. They tried to hide the truth, but their eyes were practically screaming subtitles. They thought they were holding a poker face, but the universe clearly rated it 1 star. So now we're here. The moment the mask slipped, the truth tumbled out, and the entire conspiracy unraveled in front of them, like a cheap mystery novel, with pages missing. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a full revelation of what people do when their own games turn on them. This is what happens when the plot against you backfires so violently that even the plotters can't keep it together. Let's break it open. Number 1, their plot didn't fail because you were protected. It failed because they never understood you in the first place. People often think that when someone tries to bring you down and it doesn't work, it's because you had some mystical shield around you. But the truth is usually far simpler and far more uncomfortable for them. Their plan failed because they never truly knew who they were dealing with. They built their entire strategy on a version of you that existed only in their heads, a version that was weaker, slower, clueless, and easier to manipulate. That version was convenient for their ego, but completely disconnected from reality. They underestimated your resilience because they never bothered to understand how you grew. They misread your calm as ignorance, your patience as weakness, and your silence as lack of awareness. They didn't realize that you had already outgrown many of the vulnerabilities they were aiming at. Their whole plot was designed for the old you they remembered, not the evolved you that now walked with a sharper sense of self and a clearer understanding of people. Their misunderstanding ran deeper than assumptions. They didn't know your values, your priorities, or how your mind works. They expected you to react predictably, but you didn't. They expected you to fall apart, but you didn't. And they expected you to need them more than you actually did. Their plot was basically a house built on sand, destined to sink because it had no foundation in who you actually are. The funniest part is that they thought they were 5 steps ahead. Meanwhile, they didn't even realize they were preparing for the wrong game. They were so fixated on what they thought you lacked that they completely overlooked what you had gained. That gap, the space between who they thought you were and who you truly are, is where their entire plan collapsed. In the end, their plot didn't fall apart because you dodged it. It fell apart because they never had the accuracy, insight, or emotional intelligence to build a plan that could survive contact with the real you. They didn't lose to your defenses. They lost to their own blindness. Number two, the moment they cracked wasn't weakness. It was truth collapsing under its own weight. When people finally spill everything, it's easy to label it as breaking or giving up. But that misses what's really happening. What actually collapses in that moment isn't their strength. It's the impossible burden of carrying a truth they can't afford to admit. Lies can be maintained for a while, especially when they're light and simple. But when a lie grows into a full plot, when it starts touching too many people, too many details, too many emotional corners, it stops being a lie and starts being a collapsing building. And buildings don't fall because the people inside are weak. They fall because physics always wins. Every secret has a cost. Every hidden intention demands energy to keep it pressed down, polished and disguised. You can only pretend for so long before the strain shows through in a twitch, a hesitation, a tone shift, a sudden rush of defensiveness. They weren't defeated by you. They were defeated by their own story becoming too heavy for them to carry. The truth wasn't sitting patiently in the dark, waiting to be discovered. It was pushing, stretching, pressing against the walls they built around it until those walls gave way. And when it finally bursts out, it always feels dramatic to the people watching, like a confession or an emotional collapse. But it's neither. It's simply the natural consequence of deception reaching its structural limit. Think about it. If they had actually been in control, they would have kept it under wraps. But control is a myth once you're juggling too many falsehoods at once. One slip, one inconsistent detail, one moment of panic, and the whole thing detonates. What makes this even more ironic is that they often blame the moment on pressure or emotion, as if those forces created the collapse. No. The collapse was already scheduled. The truth was always going to find its way out. They just happened to be present when it finally did. So when you see someone crack, don't mistake it for fragility. Recognize it for what it is, the unavoidable collapse of a structure built on imbalance. Lies can't stand forever. Truth always collects interest. And sooner or later it comes due, whether they're ready for it or not. Number three, their plot exposed one thing clearly. They feared your clarity more than your power. People like to pretend they're afraid of strength. They talk about power, influence, dominance, ambition. But that's not what rattles them. What rattles them is clarity. When someone can see through games, see through tone, see through intention, and see through manipulation without even raising their voice, that's the kind of person that keeps insecure people awake at night. Power can be challenged. Clarity can't. When you understand people quickly, when you pick up on contradictions, when you read the emotional weather beneath someone's words, it strips manipulators of their favorite tool, confusion. They rely on fog, on half-truths, on making you second-guess yourself until you stop trusting your own judgment. Clarity destroys that entire ecosystem. It leaves them with nothing to operate on. They can't twist what you already understand, and they can't scare someone who isn't lost. That's why their plot wasn't really about harming you. It was about regaining control over a situation they felt slipping away the moment you stopped being easy to play. Your calm became threatening because it wasn't naive. Your silence became threatening because it wasn't empty. Your observations became threatening because they weren't guesses. They were accurate. To someone who thrives on emotional manipulation, a clear-minded person is like staring at sunlight through eyes that can't handle it. They can't look directly. They can't operate effectively. And they can't predict what you'll do because you're not reacting to their illusions. You're reacting to reality. So when they cracked, it wasn't because they feared what you could do to them. It was because they feared that you already understood them better than they understood themselves. That kind of self-awareness in another person feels like exposure, even when no accusation is made. It feels like being seen without consent. In the end, clarity is a form of power that can't be countered, because it removes the battlefield entirely. There's no room for lies when someone can hear the hollow underneath the words. There's no room for schemes when someone recognizes motives before they're spoken. And that is what truly terrified them. Not your strength, not your influence, but your honesty with yourself and your ability to read the truth even when others try very hard to blur it. Number 4. They weren't united against you. They were united by a shared insecurity you triggered. When people get together to scheme, it's easy to mistake their coordination for purpose or loyalty. But in truth, what binds groups like that isn't conviction, it's comfort. They weren't sitting in some grand council plotting your downfall because they loved the idea of teamwork. They were clinging to each other because deep down they felt small, threatened, and painfully aware that they couldn't stand on their own without someone to echo their fears back to them. Insecurity is strangely social. One person feels overlooked, another feels underestimated, another feels like they're always 2 steps behind everyone else. And suddenly they find this temporary warmth in being aligned. It looks like unity from the outside. Inside, it's just a circle of people whispering the same doubts until those doubts sound like strength. Your presence disrupted that. Not because you did anything dramatic, but because you existed in a way that didn't require them to exaggerate themselves or defend their fragile egos. When someone moves with clarity, purpose, or self-awareness, it exposes cracks in others that they've been hiding for years. They felt seen, even when you weren't looking at them. They felt judged, even when you weren't judging. They felt threatened, even when you weren't threatening. So they gathered, not to attack you, but to reassure themselves that they weren't alone in feeling inadequate. Their plot was really just a group therapy session with bad communication skills and worse intentions. The problem is that when insecurity becomes the glue, everything built on it is unstable. One crack in trust, one moment of panic, one person realizing they've gone too far, and the whole thing collapses because it was never about you. It was about them. When their plan unraveled, it wasn't proof that you'd won some grand battle. It was proof that their bond was artificial, temporary, and rooted in fear rather than purpose. And that's the beautiful part. You didn't break their unity. Their own insecurity did. In the end, what they thought was a coordinated strike turned out to be a mirror they didn't want to look into. And when they finally saw their reflection clearly, not even their group could comfort them anymore. What fell apart wasn't the plan. What fell apart was the illusion that insecurity could ever hold people together for long. Number 5, the conspiracy wasn't a master plan. It was a collection of impulsive reactions dressed up as strategy. People love to mythologize their own schemes. They sit in rooms and whisper like they're characters in some dark thriller, convince themselves they're building a brilliant strategy, and then wrap their panic in fancy words to feel important. But when you strip away the dramatic music and the self-importance, what you usually find isn't genius. It's chaos pretending to be intentional. Their conspiracy wasn't crafted with patience or insight. It was built moment by moment, reaction by reaction. Someone felt slighted, someone felt jealous, someone felt left out. And instead of processing those emotions like adults, they pointed those feelings outward and called it a plan. When people act from bruised pride, what they produce is always jittery, inconsistent, and fragile. It looks impressive only to those already blinded by their own insecurity. That's why it failed so quickly. Real strategy is rooted in understanding people, understanding consequences, understanding timing. What they had was none of that. They didn't study you. They didn't study themselves. They didn't even study the situation. They just reacted, then justified, then reacted again, when their own reactions created new problems they hadn't anticipated. It's like building a staircase by guessing where the next step should be. Eventually you walk off into thin air. The funniest part is watching how they tried to hold it together when it started falling apart. They layered excuses on top of contradictions until even they couldn't remember which story they were telling. They confused urgency with purpose and noise with progress. A plan that can't survive basic scrutiny isn't a plan. It's a tantrum wearing a suit. When the truth started peeling through their narrative, it wasn't because you exposed it. It was because their own structure couldn't handle daylight. Fraudulent strategy always collapses under the simplest questioning. Real strategy adapts. Fake strategy breaks. In the end, their grand conspiracy revealed something very ordinary. People who act without clarity will always mistake their impulses for intelligence. And when those impulses finally meet reality, they evaporate. Not because reality is cruel, but because reality always demands honesty, coherence, and calm, qualities they never bothered to develop in the first place. Number 6, their confession showed that guilt eventually becomes louder than loyalty. There's a strange moment that happens in people when they're carrying something they can't stomach anymore. It doesn't come as a dramatic emotional breakdown or a sudden moral awakening like movies love to pretend. It comes as a quiet, persistent pressure that grows until it starts shouting through their actions. You can hear it in their hesitation, see it in their avoidance, feel it in how they can't meet eyes anymore. Guilt has a way of turning up the volume until even the most stubborn person can't pretend they can't hear it. Loyalty, when it's real, is calm. It's steady, grounded, and it holds even when it's inconvenient. But loyalty built on convenience, fear, or group pressure is flimsy. It bends at the first sign of discomfort. And when those two forces collide, guilt and fake loyalty, guilt always wins because it comes from inside, not from social expectation. When they confessed, it wasn't bravery. It wasn't honesty suddenly knocking on their door. It was the natural consequence of carrying a weight they never trained themselves to handle. The human mind can rationalize almost anything until it can't anymore, until the moral dissonance gets so loud that it overwhelms all the excuses they've been stacking like cheap containers in a closet ready to collapse. What's even more fascinating is how people misread that moment. They think confession is about clearing the air or making amends. Most of the time it's about relieving internal pressure, about finally stopping the internal arguments that have been burning through their thoughts for days or weeks. They weren't telling you because they suddenly respected you. They were telling you because they couldn't respect themselves while still holding it. And once it's out, once the truth leaves their mouth, you can almost watch their shoulders drop, like someone finally lifted something off their chest. That relief is the giveaway. Loyal people don't need relief from honesty. Dishonest people do. So their confession revealed more than their intentions. It revealed the hierarchy inside them. Guilt sits above loyalty, because loyalty was never genuine to begin with. When the foundation is hollow, it can't support much. And when the internal pressure builds high enough, it will always break through, no matter how well they thought they were playing the game. In the end, their confession didn't expose you. It exposed them. Number 7, they didn't crack because of pressure. They cracked because they realized you never needed them. There's a kind of panic that hits people when they discover their role in someone's life isn't as essential as they convinced themselves it was. It's not anger, it's not jealousy, it's something more primal, a fear of being irrelevant. When you go through life self-reliant, steady, and capable, you're giving off a message without speaking: I can stand on my own. And for people who secretly rely on being leaned on, or being needed, or being the center of someone's emotional orbit, that's a threat they can't articulate but feel instantly. When they realized you didn't need them, it wasn't pressure that broke them. Pressure is external. This was internal. This was ego collapsing under the weight of reality. They had built a story about themselves that depended on you needing them. They thought their value came from being required, not from being worthwhile. When that illusion shattered, they didn't know how to function without it. That's why their behavior became inconsistent. That's why they started overcompensating, pushing, manipulating, reacting too strongly to harmless things. Because they were fighting a losing battle to stay relevant in a space you'd already outgrown. They weren't reacting to what you did. They were reacting to what you no longer needed. People who are truly valuable don't panic when they're not needed every second. They know their value is intrinsic. But people who measure their worth by dependency, they unravel when independence shows up. They feel like the ground is disappearing beneath them, even when nothing is actually changing except your own growth. In that moment of realization, they weren't thinking clearly. They weren't strategizing. They weren't even being malicious anymore. They were grieving a version of themselves they had been polishing for years, a role they played for attention, for comfort, for identity. And when they lost that role, even for a moment, the cracks became impossible to hide. So when they finally broke open and spilled everything, it wasn't because you pushed them. It wasn't because the situation became too intense. It was because they saw, maybe for the first time, that you didn't need them to survive, to progress, or to be whole. And that kind of realization can't be handled with lies. It can't be smoothed over. It can't be negotiated. It can only break. Number 8. The entire plot revealed who was watching your life like a spectator sport. There's a cold kind of awareness that hits when you realize some people aren't invested in your growth, your happiness, or your success. They're invested in the drama they can extract from it. They sit on the sidelines, popcorn in hand, waiting for a stumble, a misstep, a moment they can replay in their own head to feel superior or validated. They don't want you to fail because they're evil. They want you to fail because it makes their own life feel less stagnant. When the plot came apart, it revealed something far more unsettling than betrayal. It revealed an audience. Not friends, not allies, not even critics with purpose. Just watchers. People who treat your life like a series they can comment on without ever participating in. And that kind of voyeurism says more about them than anything they could ever do to you. It's strange how some people equate someone else's downfall with their own progress. They mistake watching for understanding and criticism for contribution. They feel brilliant judging from the stands while never stepping onto the field, where real effort, real risk, and real failure actually happen. When they started plotting, they thought they were taking control of the story. What they actually did was expose the fact that they've been reading your life like it's entertainment long before they decided to interfere. The moment they cracked, their mask slipped, and suddenly it was obvious. They never saw you as a person with agency, complexity, and growth. They saw a storyline they could manipulate for their own emotional payoff. There's something almost tragic about it, because it shows how small their world has become. When your own life isn't compelling enough to hold your attention, you start hunting for meaning in other people's mistakes. When your own progress feels slow, you try to accelerate it by dragging someone else down in your imagination. But here's the twist. Being watched doesn't make you weaker. It makes you more powerful than they expected, because their entire performance depended on you being predictable, passive, unaware, and none of those things were true. So when the truth came out, it didn't just expose their intentions, it exposed their audience mentality. And once you see that clearly, you stop feeling betrayed and start feeling detached, because you can't be hurt by people who were never actually engaging with you in the first place. They were only watching. Number 9, you never lost power. They just miscalculated its source. When people come after you, they always assume your power is something external. Connections, reputation, luck, influence, people around you. They build their strategy like engineers working off faulty blueprints, not realizing the foundation they're attacking doesn't actually exist where they think it does. They thought if they cut off your support, they could weaken you. They thought if they damaged your image, they could silence you. They thought if they created chaos, they could make you fold. But power isn't a social construct you can sabotage. Power is internal. It's mindset, discipline, clarity, self-respect, and the ability to keep walking even when the path gets ugly. That kind of power can't be poisoned, can't be stolen, can't be lied away. You can't sabotage a person's character with rumors, and you can't sabotage a person's growth with petty schemes. Their biggest mistake was believing that what makes you strong is something they can touch. They didn't understand that your strength isn't in who you know, it's in how you think. It isn't in how people treat you, it's in how you treat yourself. It isn't in applause or validation, it's in consistency when no one is watching. So when their plot collapsed, it wasn't because you dodged it or defended yourself with some dramatic force. It collapsed because it was aimed at the wrong target entirely. They fired arrows into air and wondered why nothing happened. They built traps in places you stopped walking long ago. They attacked a shadow and called it victory when it dissolved. The funniest part is how shocked they were when they realized the damage they thought they dealt barely left a scratch. They expected cracks and saw none. They expected hesitation and saw confidence. They expected disruption and saw calm. Because they never understood the engine powering you, and you can't break what you can't even identify. In the end, losing power was never on the table. What was on the table was their own misunderstanding, their own arrogance, and their own inability to look deeper than surface-level influence. So when they failed, it wasn't proof of your invincibility. It was proof of something even more important. They don't get to define where your power comes from. You do. Number 10. Their plot showed you exactly who was benefiting from your humility. Humility is one of those traits people celebrate in theory but exploit in practice. When you're kind, patient, soft-spoken, and unwilling to make a scene, some people treat that not as a virtue but as an open invitation. They slide into the space your generosity leaves, take advantage of the silence you hold, and build comfort on the idea that you won't call them out, even when they're stepping over boundaries you never set loudly enough. When their plot came to light, it exposed something deeper than betrayal. It peeled back the curtain on who had been thriving on the version of you that refused to confront, refused to retaliate, refused to turn small offenses into big arguments. Your humility wasn't just a personality trait, it was a resource, and they were mining it without guilt, without effort, without even realizing how dependent they'd become on a kindness they never intended to repay. It's always shocking the first time you see it clearly. The people who talk loud about integrity but collapse when they can't lean on someone else's restraint. The ones who take your calm as permission, your forgiveness as a pattern, your understanding as a guarantee that you'll keep absorbing their mistakes without complaint. Their plot didn't just show their intentions, it revealed their dependency. They needed you to stay humble because it kept their own flaws hidden and their own discomfort manageable. When you don't create friction, they get to avoid growth. When you don't confront, they get to stay unchanged. When you swallow what hurts, they get to pretend they never did anything wrong. And that realization hits harder than the betrayal itself, because it forces you to ask a question most people avoid. Who in my life is comfortable because I refuse to make them uncomfortable? It's not about becoming harsh or losing warmth. It's about understanding that virtue without boundaries becomes fuel for people who don't deserve it. When their conspiracy unraveled, it wasn't just their intentions that were exposed, it was the hidden economy of giving and taking that had been operating silently around you. And once you see that system, once you finally identify who was profiting off your humility, you can't unsee it. That's the real power in truth. It turns kindness back into choice instead of obligation. Number 11, they studied your weaknesses but ignored your evolution. When people plan against you, they usually dig through the past because it's easy. The past leaves fingerprints, the past leaves patterns. The past can be analyzed like old data on a broken hard drive. They look at who you were months ago, years ago, sometimes even decades ago, and think they've cracked the code. But what they forget, what they can't seem to grasp, is that people evolve, quietly, steadily, without fanfare, without updates or notifications, without anyone else noticing until it's too late. They studied your old doubts, your old mistakes, your old softness, and built their entire strategy on that outdated blueprint. But growth isn't flashy. It doesn't come with fireworks or announcements. It comes with subtle shifts, harder boundaries, sharper instincts, deeper self-respect, quieter confidence. It comes with learning how to read people, learning how to stop giving energy to what drains you, learning how to walk away from what doesn't serve you. They didn't account for that. They didn't even consider it possible. To them, people stay the same because it's comforting to believe change is rare. It makes their own stagnation feel normal. If you evolve, it forces them to confront their own lack of progress, and that's a mirror they avoid at all costs. So they attack the ghost of who you once were, not the person standing in front of them now. They expected hesitation and saw certainty. They expected insecurity and saw composure. They expected emotional volatility and saw discipline. Every assumption they made was answered with a contradiction, and each contradiction weakened their plan until it collapsed under the weight of their own incompetence. What they thought was clever analysis turned out to be amateur psychology. What they thought was insight turned out to be nostalgia dressed as strategy. They thought they were dealing with someone predictable, someone moldable, someone who hadn't yet learned their own worth. But evolution changes the rules. It changes the tempo. It changes how you respond and what you tolerate and what you ignore. They didn't realize that by the time they started plotting, you were already miles beyond their reach, living in a version of yourself they hadn't even imagined. So when their plan failed, it wasn't luck. It wasn't protection. It was simply reality proving that growth is the greatest defense and the one most people forget to plan for. Number 12. Their confession wasn't an apology. It was self-preservation. When someone suddenly opens up, it can sound noble on the surface, like they've reached some moral peak or rediscovered their conscience. But if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the rhythm underneath their words, you'll hear something else entirely. Panic. Not the panic of being caught, but the panic of being exposed to themselves. An apology is outward-facing. It cares about the person harmed. It acknowledges pain, responsibility, and impact. What they offered wasn't that. What they offered was a pressure release valve. They weren't trying to mend anything. They were trying to stop the internal damage they'd been causing themselves for weeks or months. Carrying a lie is like walking around with a stone in your shoe. At first it's small. You adjust. You ignore it. You convince yourself it's fine. But the longer it sits there, the deeper it digs in. And eventually every step hurts. At a certain point, confession stops being moral and starts being mechanical. It's no longer about right or wrong. It's about survival. When they spoke, Their focus wasn't on you, it was on them. Their tone wasn't repentant, it was relieved. Their words weren't designed to heal. They were designed to detach themselves from the weight they could no longer hold. It's the difference between someone saying, "I'm sorry you're hurt," and someone saying, "I can't carry this anymore." The irony is that people who confess for self-preservation often think they're doing something virtuous, when in reality they're just stepping out of their own discomfort and calling it bravery. They mistake the removal of their own suffering for an act of kindness. And the moment you see that distinction, the entire scene rewrites itself. What looked like remorse becomes a mirror reflecting their limits, their fear, their lack of emotional endurance. Because genuine apology asks, "How can I make this right?" Self-preserving confession asks, "How can I stop feeling this?" So when their truth spilled out, it wasn't redemption and it wasn't reconciliation. It was their own survival instinct kicking in, the same instinct that makes people finally breathe after holding their breath too long. In the end, their confession revealed less about their character and more about their threshold. And once you understand that, you stop being moved by the performance and start seeing the mechanism underneath. Number 13. Their plot unintentionally proved your value. There's a strange truth people don't like admitting. No one wastes time plotting against someone who doesn't matter. When you're irrelevant, you're invisible. When you're harmless, you're forgettable. When you're insignificant, you're left alone because there's nothing there worth the emotional or intellectual energy it takes to plan, whisper, coordinate, and deceive. So when their plot came into the open, it didn't just expose their intentions, it highlighted something they never meant to admit. You have weight, you have influence, you have presence, not the loud kind, not the flashy kind, the kind that shifts rooms, changes conversations, affects outcomes, without needing to shout or perform. People feel threatened by value even when they can't articulate what that value is. Sometimes it's competence, sometimes it's consistency, sometimes it's integrity. Sometimes it's simply the fact that you don't crumble under pressure the way they do. Value isn't always measured in applause. Often it's measured in the discomfort it causes in those who can't match it. Their energy alone is proof. Conspiracy requires motivation, emotional investment, and a belief, conscious or not, that removing or weakening you would create a benefit for them. That belief is a backhanded compliment, even if it came wrapped in jealousy or insecurity. What makes it even more powerful is that you didn't earn their reaction by chasing attention or demanding recognition. You earned it by being yourself in a way that's unmistakable. People like that stand out not because they want to, but because they can't help it. When they finally cracked and revealed everything, they thought they were exposing a weakness. Instead, they held up a mirror showing their own obsession with your presence. The more they tried to undermine you, the clearer it became how much you mattered. It's like someone building a magnifying glass to burn a hole in something, only to realize they've just revealed how brightly it reflects light. So take it for what it is: unintended validation. Proof that your character, your growth, your clarity, and your impact resonate deeper than you may even realize. In a world full of people chasing relevance, sometimes the greatest confirmation comes from those who can't stop reacting to you. And that, whether they meant it or not, speaks louder than any praise ever could. Number 14. When they finally cracked, they revealed something more important than betrayal. They revealed the limits of their world. Betrayal is painful, yes, but it's simple. It has a beginning and an end. What cuts deeper is what betrayal exposes about the person who commits it. When they finally cracked and spilled everything, it wasn't just their intentions that were on display. It was the size of their imagination, the depth of their courage, and the ceiling they've accepted for themselves without ever questioning it. People who operate in small worlds can't comprehend abundance. They can't imagine two people succeeding without one being pushed down. They can't imagine growth without competition. They can't imagine joy without jealousy. So they convince themselves that the only way to rise is to pull someone else down, and the only way to feel secure is to make another person feel unstable. When they broke, they revealed that worldview openly. They revealed a mind trapped in scarcity, a heart conditioned to distrust progress, and a logic loop that says, if they get better, I must get worse. That's not malice. That's limitation. It's almost tragic how predictable it becomes. When you can't imagine a bigger life, you start fighting ghosts in other people's stories. When you can't imagine self-improvement, you become obsessed with controlling someone else's trajectory. When you can't imagine being enough on your own, you try to rewrite everyone else until they fit your insecurity. So when they confessed, it wasn't the climax of some dramatic scheme. It was the moment their internal walls became visible, the moment you saw exactly how far they can go and how quickly they stop when they reach the edge. And here's the real twist. Once you see those limits clearly, the betrayal stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like information. You understand why they acted the way they did. You understand that it wasn't about you at all. It was about the prison they've built around themselves. Their world is a small room with no windows. Yours isn't. When they cracked, they didn't expose your vulnerability. They exposed their own confinement. And in that revelation, you gain something more powerful than anger or hurt. You gain clarity. Because once you see the limits of someone's world, you stop expecting them to ever meet you anywhere beyond it. And you can finally walk forward without carrying their ceiling on your back. When all is said and done, what this whole collapse reveals is not just that someone plotted against you, but that their own fears, misunderstandings, limitations, and insecurities did more damage to them than any plan ever could to you. Their plot failed not because you were lucky, but because they were blind. They cracked not because they were pushed, but because they could no longer carry the truth they buried. They confessed not out of courage, but out of survival. And in every slip, every contradiction, every panic, they showed you more about themselves than they ever intended to show. What makes this story powerful isn't the betrayal. It's the awakening it forces. You see who misread you, who depended on your kindness, who watched you like entertainment, who feared your clarity, who underestimated your growth, and who can't imagine a life bigger than their own narrow vision. And when you see all of that clearly, you stop feeling threatened. You stop feeling confused. You stop feeling guilty or responsible for their choices. Instead, you walk away with something rare, understanding. Understanding that growth is the strongest shield. Understanding that clarity is more dangerous than power. Understanding that humility is a gift, but boundaries are wisdom. Understanding that evolution is invisible to those who refuse to evolve. Understanding that people expose themselves long before you ever need to expose them. So take that with you. Don't let the noise distract you from the lesson. Don't let their collapse pull you backward. Their world is small, but yours doesn't have to be. If this video gave you even a single moment of clarity or that little aha spark you've been looking for, then do me a huge favor. Subscribe to the channel, drop a like, leave a comment with what hit you the hardest, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the truth isn't meant to sit quietly, it's meant to be passed on. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay blessed always.